Frank Parker sat at his kitchen table, staring at the steaming cup of black coffee in front of him. The rising curls of steam seemed to dance aimlessly, much like his thoughts these days. The old house creaked around him, its walls too familiar and its silence too profound. It was the same house he and Mary had bought 50 years ago, filled with laughter, love, and the noisy footsteps of their children. Now it was quiet, too quiet. He looked out the window at the neatly trimmed lawn, the garden Mary had loved, now overgrown and untamed. A bird flitted by, landing on the fence post. Frank watched it for a while, his mind drifting back to memories of Mary planting tulips and humming an old tune. A lump formed in his throat. It had been 10 years since she'd passed, but the ache of her absence hadn't dulled. If anything, it had grown sharper with each passing year. Frank sighed and turned his gaze to the photograph on the mantel. Mary's warm smile looked back at him, frozen in time, a stark contrast to his reflection in the window, wrinkled, weary, and alone. The photo frame was surrounded by medals and awards from his time in the military, but even those triumphs felt distant, like they belonged to someone else. He pushed the coffee away and shuffled into the living room, the soft thud of his cane against the hardwood floor echoing in the emptiness. Sitting down in his favorite recliner, he turned on the television, flipping aimlessly through channels. Nothing caught his interest. He turned it off and leaned back, closing his eyes. "Grandpa," a cheerful voice called from the door, breaking the monotony of his thoughts. He opened his eyes to see his granddaughter, Emily, stepping inside with her usual energy. She was a college student now, bright-eyed and full of life. A reminder of a world that kept moving forward even as he felt stuck in place. "Hi, sweetheart," Frank said, forcing a smile. He loved her visits, though they always reminded him of how much he missed having people around. Emily set down her bag and plopped onto the couch. "How are you doing, Grandpa?" Frank shrugged. "Same as always. Just me in the house." Emily frowned. You don't have to be alone all the time. There are plenty of ways to stay busy or make new friends. Have you thought about going to the community center? Or maybe getting a pet?" Frank raised an eyebrow. "A pet? At my age? What would I do with a pet? Besides, I'm not sure I've got the energy to keep up with one." Emily leaned forward, her eyes sparkling with enthusiasm. "Grandpa, pets are great companions. They give you a reason to get out of the house, and they're amazing for your mental health. Plus, you'd be giving a dog or cat a second chance at life." Frank chuckled softly. "I don't know, sounds like more trouble than it's worth." "Come on," she pressed. "It doesn't have to be a puppy or anything high maintenance. Just a sweet, older dog that needs someone to love them. You'd be perfect for each other." He sighed, leaning back in his chair. The idea wasn't entirely unappealing, but he wasn't convinced. "I wouldn't know the first thing about finding the right one," he admitted. Emily grinned and pulled a pamphlet out of her bag. "Funny you should mention that. I stopped by the animal shelter the other day to drop off some blankets, and they gave me this. Look at these faces, Grandpa." She handed him the pamphlet, her enthusiasm contagious. Frank took it reluctantly, his fingers brushing the glossy paper. The cover showed a collage of dogs and cats, each with a hopeful expression. He flipped through it, scanning the pictures. His heart gave a small twinge as he saw the sad eyes of a pit bull in one of the photos. The dog's face was scarred, but its gaze was soft, almost pleading. "That one," he muttered, more to himself than to Emily. Emily leaned over to see which picture he was pointing at. "Buddy," she read aloud. "He's been at the shelter for a while. It looks like he needs someone, Grandpa. Kind of like you do." Frank shook his head. "I'm not promising anything, Emily. I'll think about it, that's all. That's all I'm asking," she said with a smile, getting up to leave. "Just think about it." After she left, Frank found himself staring at the pamphlet again. Something about the dog's eyes lingered in his mind, a strange pull he couldn't explain. He set the pamphlet on the coffee table, but even as he tried to distract himself with the television or a book, his thoughts kept drifting back to the picture. That night, as he lay in bed, the house seemed quieter than usual. He turned over, his hand brushing the empty side of the bed where Mary used to sleep. He closed his eyes, but sleep didn't come easily. Instead, the image of the pit bull's soulful eyes floated in his mind, mingling with memories of his own loneliness. By morning, the decision was made. He didn't tell himself it was permanent or that he'd come home with a dog. He just told himself he'd go. Just a look, nothing more. Frank woke early the next morning, though he wasn't sure why. It wasn't his usual routine. Most days, he lingered in bed, dragging himself up only when the stiffness in his back became too much to bear. But today felt different. Maybe it was the promise he'd silently made to himself the night before. Or perhaps it was just the lingering image of those sad, brown eyes staring back at him from the pamphlet. After his morning coffee and a light breakfast, Frank put on his old tweed jacket and his well-worn walking shoes. He glanced at the pamphlet one last time, then folded it neatly and tucked it into his pocket. As he opened the front door, a gust of crisp autumn air greeted him. The golden leaves crunched beneath his feet as he made his way to the car. The drive to the shelter was quiet, save for the hum of the engine and the occasional creak of his old car's suspension. Frank's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, and his mind wandered as he passed familiar landmarks. He hadn't driven out this way in years, not since Mary had been alive. They used to visit the park nearby, walking hand in hand and laughing about how they were the old married couple among the joggers and young families. Now, every turn on the road felt like a bittersweet trip through time. When he finally pulled into the gravel lot of the shelter, Frank hesitated. The building was small but bustling, with volunteers moving in and out, carrying leashes, bowls, and crates. He watched as a young couple walked out with a small dog wagging its tail excitedly. They looked happy, complete in a way that made Frank's heart ache. He took a deep breath, grabbed his cane, and stepped out of the car. The crunch of gravel underfoot seemed louder than it should have been, and as he approached the entrance, he felt a wave of uncertainty. Was this really a good idea? What if the dog didn't like him? What if he was too old to take care of it properly? He shook his head, trying to push the doubts aside. The door chimed as he stepped inside, and a young woman with a bright smile greeted him from behind the counter. Her name tag read Mia. "Good morning, sir. How can we help you today?" Frank cleared his throat, feeling a little self-conscious. I'm just here to look. My granddaughter gave me one of your pamphlets." Mia's smile widened. "That's wonderful. Take your time. If you have any questions or want to meet one of the animals, just let me know." Frank nodded and glanced around. The walls were covered with photos of animals, some with captions celebrating their adoptions. Max found his forever home, and Luna is now part of a loving family. He noticed a large bulletin board with notices about volunteer opportunities and a list of donations needed. It all felt foreign to him, a world he'd never stepped into before. Mia came around the counter and gestured toward a hallway. "If you'd like, I can show you to the kennels. Most of the dogs are back there." Frank hesitated, then nodded. "Sure, why not?" The hallway was lined with doors, and as Mia opened one, the sound hit him immediately, a cacophony of barks, whines, and yips. The kennel was clean and well lit, but the sheer energy of the place was overwhelming. Dogs of all shapes and sizes filled the cages, some wagging their tails eagerly, others lying quietly in the corners. "Take your time," Mia said, stepping aside to let him walk down the aisle at his own pace. Frank moved slowly, his cane tapping against the concrete floor. He glanced at each dog as he passed. There were small terriers bouncing excitedly, large shepherds with alert ears, and everything in between. Some barked at him, as if trying to get his attention, while others simply watched him with curious eyes. As he neared the end of the row, he saw him, the pit bull from the pamphlet. The dog was larger than Frank had expected, his broad chest and muscular frame making him look intimidating at first glance. But his face was what stopped Frank in his tracks. The dog sat quietly at the back of the cage, his head resting on his paws. When their eyes met, the pit bull lifted his head and his expression shifted. He let out a low, mournful whimper, his entire body trembling as he stood and moved closer to the bars. "That's Buddy," Mia said softly, coming up beside Frank. "He's been with us for a while. He was found wandering near an old military base a few years ago. No one knows much about his past, but he's a sweet boy. He's just had a hard time trusting people, Frank knelt down slowly, his knees protesting the movement, and reached a hand toward the cage. Buddy hesitated for a moment, then sniffed the air cautiously before pressing his nose to the bars. Frank's hand trembled as he touched the dog's fur, and Buddy closed his eyes, letting out another quiet whine. Frank felt a lump rise in his throat. There was something in Buddy's eyes, something that spoke of pain, of loss, and of a yearning for connection. It was a look Frank recognized all too well, because he saw it in the mirror every day. "He seems to like you," Mia said, her voice warm. "Would you like to spend some time with him in the playroom?" Frank hesitated. "I'm not sure. I didn't come here planning to. Just a few minutes," Mia encouraged. "No pressure." Frank nodded reluctantly. Mia opened the cage, and Buddy stepped out cautiously. He was even larger up close, his body scarred in places, his ears slightly uneven. But his demeanor was gentle, almost hesitant, as if he wasn't sure he was allowed to hope. They led Buddy to a small, enclosed room with toys and a cushioned mat. Frank sat down on a bench, and Buddy sat a few feet away, watching him. After a moment, the dog got up and walked over, resting his head on Frank's knee. The gesture was simple, but it hit Frank like a freight train. He felt tears welling up in his eyes as he gently stroked Buddy's head. The dog closed his eyes, leaning into the touch as if he had been waiting for this moment for a long time. Frank looked up at Mia, his voice shaky. He's a good boy. He really is," she said, "and he's been waiting for someone like you." Frank didn't say anything, but in his heart, he knew the decision had already been made. Frank brought Buddy home that same afternoon. The shelter staff helped load the dog into his car, and despite Buddy's size, he climbed into the back seat with surprising gentleness. Frank glanced in the rearview mirror as he drove, watching Buddy sit quietly, his big head turning to look out the window now and then. It was as if the dog knew he was heading somewhere important, somewhere safe. When they arrived, Frank opened the car door and Buddy jumped down, landing lightly despite his size. Frank led him to the front porch, where Buddy paused, sniffing the air and looking around. Frank unlocked the door and stepped inside, holding the leash loosely. Buddy hesitated for a moment before following, his movements cautious, his eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings. "This is it," Frank said awkwardly, gesturing around the living room. "Not much, but it's home." Buddy sniffed the carpet, the corners of the furniture, and even the base of the old recliner. When he was satisfied, he turned and looked at Frank, his eyes soft and questioning, as if asking permission to stay. "Go on, make yourself comfortable," Frank said, pointing at the dog bed he'd hastily picked up from the shelter store. Buddy walked over to it, circled twice, and lay down with a heavy sigh. Frank chuckled, feeling a strange warmth spread through him. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel quite so empty. That evening, Frank prepared his usual simple dinner, grilled chicken and steamed vegetables. He set aside a small piece of chicken for Buddy, unsure if it was allowed, but unable to resist the pleading look the dog gave him as he sat nearby. "You've probably had worse," Frank muttered, dropping the chicken into Buddy's bowl. The dog wagged his tail as he ate, his enthusiasm bringing a smile to Frank's face. Over the next few days, they settled into a routine. Frank woke early, as he always did, and Buddy would rise with him, padding softly to the kitchen and sitting patiently while Frank made his coffee. They took slow walks around the neighborhood, Buddy staying close to Frank's side, his leash slack. Neighbors who had barely spoken to Frank in years stopped to admire the dog, commenting on his calm demeanor and striking appearance. "You've got a good one there," one neighbor said, patting Buddy's head. Frank nodded, a small swell of pride rising in his chest. At home, Buddy followed Frank everywhere, his large frame surprisingly quiet as he moved through the house. He seemed to sense Frank's moods, staying close when the old man sat in his recliner, lost in thought, and wagging his tail gently when Frank spoke to him. They didn't need words. Their bond grew stronger with each passing day. One afternoon, while brushing Buddy's coat, Frank noticed something odd. The dog's collar had a hidden compartment, a small flap that was barely visible. Curious, Frank opened it and found a weathered tag inside. His hands trembled as he read the name etched into the metal, Sergeant Daniel H. Morris. Frank froze, his breath catching in his throat. The name was familiar, too familiar. Daniel Morris had been his closest friend during the war. They'd shared everything: meals, stories, and the burdens of battle. Daniel had been the one to keep spirits high when things looked bleak. He'd also been the one who didn't come home. Frank sat down heavily, the tag clutched in his hand. Memories flooded back, memories he had tried to keep buried. The two of them had been stationed in a remote, war-torn village, working to secure the area. It had been a grueling mission, and Daniel had befriended a stray dog, a pit bull who'd wandered into their camp one night. "Look at this guy," Daniel had said, scratching behind the dog's ears. "He's a survivor, just like us." The dog, whom Daniel named Buddy, had quickly become part of the unit, providing comfort and even warning them of danger on more than one occasion. Frank remembered the night Daniel had been killed, how Buddy had howled, refusing to leave his side. Frank's eyes filled with tears as he looked at the dog now lying at his feet. The same soulful eyes staring back at him. Could it really be the same Buddy? It seemed impossible, yet the evidence was right there in his hand. He reached out and stroked Buddy's head. "Is it you, boy? Did you really find me after all these years?" Buddy leaned into his touch, his tail wagging slowly. Frank felt a deep ache in his chest, a mix of grief and gratitude. He thought of Daniel, of the sacrifice he'd made, and of the bond they had shared. Somehow, against all odds, this dog had found his way back to him. It was as if Daniel himself had sent Buddy to watch over him, to remind him that he wasn't alone. Frank decided to learn more. He called the shelter and spoke to Mia, who promised to look into Buddy's history. A few days later, she called back with news. "It's remarkable, Mr. Parker," she said. "Buddy was found near an old military base and brought to us about 3 years ago. We don't know how long he'd been out there, but the tag matches records from your unit. It's definitely the same dog." Frank hung up the phone, his heart heavy but full. He looked at Buddy, who was lying on the rug with his head on his paws. "You've been through a lot, haven't you, boy?" he said softly. Buddy's ears perked up, and he thumped his tail against the floor. From that moment on, Frank felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just caring for a dog. He was honoring a bond that had survived decades and miles. He began sharing stories of Daniel with Buddy, talking to him as if the dog could understand. "You remember that time we snuck rations to the kids in the village?" Frank said one evening, scratching Buddy's ears. "Daniel always said you were the smartest one in the unit." Buddy wagged his tail, his eyes never leaving Frank's face. Each day, Frank felt a little lighter, his steps a little steadier. He and Buddy weren't just surviving. They were healing together. The days turned into weeks, and Frank and Buddy became inseparable. Every morning, they shared their quiet routine. Frank's slow shuffle to the kitchen for coffee and toast, Buddy's patient wait by his side, and then their walks through the neighborhood. It was as if they had always been together, their rhythms perfectly in sync. The walks grew longer, the hesitation in Buddy's steps fading as he grew more confident. Neighbors, once accustomed to merely waving at Frank from a distance, now stopped to greet him, drawn in by Buddy's gentle demeanor. The dog, who had once been so timid, wagged his tail freely, leaning into every offered hand for a scratch behind the ears. "You've brought the whole neighborhood together," one woman said to Frank, smiling as Buddy licked her fingers. "I don't think I've ever seen you look this happy." Frank nodded, patting Buddy's broad back. "He's a good boy," he said simply, but the words carried the weight of a deep, unspoken gratitude. At home, Buddy seemed to settle into the house as though he had always lived there. He followed Frank from room to room, his heavy paws thudding softly on the wooden floors. At night, he curled up on his bed near the recliner, his slow, rhythmic breathing a comforting presence in the quiet house. One evening, as Frank sat in his chair with an old photo album in his lap, he found himself talking to Buddy about things he hadn't spoken of in years. "This here," he said, pointing to a faded black and white photo of his unit. "This is Daniel, the one who saved us all more times than I can count." In this, his voice caught as he pointed to a dog sitting proudly at Daniel's side. "This is you, isn't it, Buddy? You've got those same eyes, that same look. You were always part of the team." Buddy, as if understanding, rested his head on Frank's knee, and sighed deeply. Frank chuckled softly, running a hand over the dog's head. "I don't know how you found me, but I'm glad you did. I think Daniel would have wanted it this way." The seasons began to change, the air growing cooler as autumn turned to winter. Frank's joints ached more than usual, and he moved a little slower, but Buddy stayed by his side, patient and unwavering. On snowy mornings, they ventured out carefully, Buddy walking ahead as if scouting the path for his old friend. One afternoon, while they were out on one of their walks, Frank slipped on a patch of ice. His cane clattered to the ground as he fell, the cold shock of the pavement knocking the wind out of him. Buddy barked sharply, circling Frank and nudging him with his nose. Frank tried to sit up but found he couldn't. His leg throbbed painfully, and he realized he might have twisted it in the fall. "It's okay, boy," he said through gritted teeth, though his voice trembled. "I just need a minute." But Buddy wasn't waiting. The dog looked around, his ears swiveling as he took in the surroundings. Then, with a determined bark, he bolted down the street. "Buddy!" Frank called, panic rising in his chest. He struggled to sit upright, his heart sinking at the sight of the dog disappearing around the corner. Minutes felt like hours as Frank sat there, shivering in the cold. Just as he was beginning to fear the worst, he heard voices. Buddy reappeared, leading a young man and woman who were jogging in the neighborhood. "Are you okay, sir?" the man asked, kneeling beside Frank. "Your dog came running up to us, barking like crazy. He wouldn't stop until we followed him." Frank looked at Buddy, who stood close, his eyes locked on Frank as if to say, "I've got you." Emotion welled up in Frank's chest, and he nodded. "I'm fine," he said, though his voice was shaky. "Just slipped on some ice. I think my leg's twisted." The couple helped Frank up, supporting him as they walked him back to his house. Buddy stayed close, his body brushing against Frank's leg as if offering extra stability. Once inside, the couple insisted on calling a doctor to check on Frank. Buddy lay by Frank's side, his large, warm body pressed against his feet, as if refusing to leave until he was sure Frank was okay. The doctor confirmed that Frank had a sprain and would need to rest for a few weeks. "You're lucky," she said, "and it sounds like you've got this guy to thank for it." She reached down to pet Buddy, who wagged his tail softly. As the days passed and Frank recovered, Buddy rarely left his side. He seemed to know when Frank was in pain, lying close enough for Frank to rest a hand on his back. Neighbors dropped by with meals and offers to help, all of them charmed by Buddy's quiet devotion. The incident only strengthened the bond between man and dog. Frank often found himself looking at Buddy with a sense of wonder. "You've saved me in more ways than one," he told the dog one evening as they sat by the fire. Buddy lifted his head, his tail thumping softly against the floor. As winter melted into spring, Frank and Buddy continued their walks, though Frank was more careful now, always watching for patches of ice. The story of Buddy's heroics had spread through the neighborhood, and people often stopped to greet them, offering treats and kind words. One day, Emily visited, bringing with her a scrapbook she'd made of photos and memories of Buddy's time with Frank. As Frank flipped through the pages, his eyes grew misty. There were pictures of their walks, of Buddy lying by the fire, and even a snapshot of the two of them sitting on the porch together. "You've given him a second chance, Grandpa," Emily said softly. "And he's done the same for you." Frank nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He looked down at Buddy, who was stretched out at his feet, his eyes half closed in contentment. For the first time in years, Frank felt truly at peace. As the sun set that evening, casting the room in a warm, golden glow, Frank sat back in his chair, Buddy lying close. He thought of Daniel, of the war, and of the long years he had spent alone. And then he thought of Buddy, the dog who had somehow found his way back to him after all those years. "Thank you, boy," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything." Buddy lifted his head, his eyes meeting Frank's, and thumped his tail once in reply. Together, they sat in the quiet house, no longer alone, but whole in a way that neither had been in years.